Good afternoon and welcome to History and Systems of Psychology. Thank you so much to those of you who braved the weather. We've had a really cold week and it sounds like next week will be sort of back to normal, but I really appreciate you being here. Overall, I was pretty pleased with the exams. I'll be sending out an email with a little bit of information about the exam and just my thoughts on that, as well as how you might best prep for exam number 2. Since I've not seen you since last week, what I'd like to do is go ahead and run through what we covered on day 10 because that was a lot of information, and then go ahead and move on with class. So we are going to be back in, I believe it's chapter 4. And we began our conversation talking about the Age of Enlightenment. So can any of you fill me in on some items that we discussed, items that were in the video we looked at in class last week?
Went from being more like high fashion to wanting to be more natural and like down to earth with like the way they dressed or the way they presented themselves.
Sure, good start. I like fashion, we'll start there.
And a lot of people tried switching from religion to reason for like a lot of ways that they switch.
Yes, and I appreciate you saying that. It is known as the Age of Reason, right? So religion had played such a strong role in people's lives
For so long, right? And all of a sudden there was a break from religion to looking at things from more, and we'll say quote unquote, reason. Other things.
There was a bunch of earthquakes and they went from blaming it on God and religion to more scientific and natural reasons.
Sure, yeah, so maybe there's something to this seismic stuff, right? Good. So looking underneath and not just saying this happened because
of God or because of the gods, but looking for reason, I guess. I don't know another way of explaining that. During this time, there was a huge amount of growth in the fine arts, in the performing arts, in literature. So it was a very exciting time if you were an intellectual during the Age of Enlightenment. And just as a reminder, this took place during the late 17th to 18th century. Lots of inventions and discoveries were made during this time. All right, so as noted earlier, we talked briefly about Hume. And Hume had some choice words to say. He said, all we can ever know about is that certain regularities occurred in the past, leading us to expect that they will occur in the future. Hume took this idea of causality and basically said, just because you expect something to happen doesn't mean it's going to happen. And Kant followed up with, if one couldn't actually know causality in nature, then the underpinnings of science and knowledge had to be challenged. Let's see. Not sure why we're having problems with that. We'll move on and circle back on that one. Okay, so the philosopher Immanuel Kant followed in the footsteps of David Hume and built off of a lot of David Hume's ideas. If you want to follow along on page 136, we see a picture of Kant on the left and David Hume on the right. when Kant talked about the world, he had a variation of what we call the nativist theme, all right? And as you recall from the first exam, if someone believes in the nativist view, what do they believe in terms of how our brain functions?
Like everything that innate in our brain will go to.
Right, so that we have these
structures, the brain is made in a way that it is wired to learn, right? And according to Kant, there were two different kinds of objects and worlds. There's the noumenal world, which is the world that's outside of our mind. And this can sometimes be a hard concept, I believe, to truly understand. I'll give an example and hopefully that will help. So the noumenal world would be something like your chair. Okay, so let's look at the chair and we see, what do we see, what can we discern with our eyes about this chair? It's green, okay? It's what? It rolls. It's sort of fuzzy. When you sit on it, is it comfortable? So-so, right? Depends what you're comparing it to. Other things.
The back is curved. How many wheels does it have? It has many wheels, I think. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. All right. So those are all things that basically make up the chair, the object as it is. We can look at, let's just
look at this table and we see, okay, it's this grayish color, right? It's pretty smooth. It has 4 silver legs and it's rectangular. Again, those are all statements about the object. That's known as the noumenal world, objects in their pure state. The caveat is that we can never, they're presumed to exist, but we can never really know objects in their pure state because immediately when we come in contact with them, whether that means we see them, we hear them, we touch them, our mind is working on them. Does that make sense? And in doing so, we are now in the phenomenal world, which is the world of the mind. In short, the ultimate reality of the noumenal world is not knowable. However, many of the characteristics that actively create that can be known through our mind. Any questions on that concept? Okay. Kant also believed that we localize experience in 2 dimensions called the intuitions. And we've heard of intuition before, right? These particular intuitions are space and time. This idea that things take up space, or we do things within a certain space and within a certain period of time. Beyond this, we further organize our subjective experiences automatically in terms of categories. And this idea of categories sounds a lot like the taxonomies of long ago, right? So again, looking at the mind as this entity that is pre-wired to categorize things in our existence so that we can better understand our world. When we categorize something, we define qualities, quantities, and relationships to one another. Within the relationship category is the concept of causality. All right. Kant had many great things to say, had lots of people during that era thinking deep thoughts, right? And maybe questioning the thoughts that they previously had about their brains, about the way the world exists. I thought this was an interesting quote. So we talked about it on Thursday, and I'll just repeat this. After stating the importance of studying the mind's organizing properties, he noted that such a study would never achieve the status of a true science like physics. Kant balked at the idea that the study of the brain could be scientific. Instead, he believed the study of the mind should always remain a philosophical discipline. Any questions on Kant? Okay, moving on to the law of specific nerve energies. I believe that in Intro to Psychology, you study the nerve and you learn all of its parts. So let's see what you remember from Intro. I know for some of you it's not been that long ago, but I'm not looking at anyone in particular. What are some parts of the nerve that you remember? Does it help if you put your hand on your head? I think that should help. It's going to just come off. Oh my gosh. We can think. So we have a neuron. Okay.
Dendrites.
Dendrites, I like it, yes. Axon, yes. And what do those axons do?
They send or receive, one of the two.
They send or receive, according to Wikipedia, right? They send and or receive signals, right? So we have a neuron, it has a cell body. It has these axons and dendrites branching off from them, right? And the axons have a sheath around them. Very good, myelin sheath. And what does that do with those impulses?
It's basically speeds it up.
You have insulation, right, and it helps speed up impulses. Some neurodegenerative diseases result because the axon starts to wither away. And because of that, then you're getting issues with nerve impulses traveling to the right place in the right amount of time. Very good. All right. Well, we're not there yet in time when we're talking about law of specific nerve energies. This is still way back in the day. All right. Descartes had something to say about these filaments of the body. Right. He gave us some rudimentary understanding or ideas about the nervous system. He believed there were hollow tubes in the brain, and through those hollow tubes, animal spirits flowed, right? And that expression was a result of that flowing through of the animal spirits. Today we talk a little bit more in terms of cerebrospinal fluid, right? But he was one of the first to really latch on to that idea. Now, when we get to the law of specific nerve energies, we get a lot more detail and we start sounding a lot more like modern science. According to this law, each sensory nerve conveys one and only one kind of sensation. You have certain nerves that are wired for visual stimuli, and you have others that are wired for auditory, more for sensations, physical sensations. This challenged the notion of the sensory nerve as something like a hollow tube capable of conveying any kind of stimulation introduced to it. So now we're saying there's more specificity among these hollow tubes. And just to recap, stating that each sensory nerve contains one and only one kind of sensation, regardless of how it is stimulated. Okay, moving on to sensory experience. This is also an idea that's building on previous thought. The immediate source of sensory experience is not the external world alone, but the sensory nervous system that's interacted with the external world. What does it mean when we talk about the nervous system interacting with the external world? What does that mean?
How your nerves process the info. It's physical.
Right, the nerves are processing that information that's coming in, right? And in part, that is due to previous experiences you've had, right? We hear a certain sound and we think it's the train. We're wired to hear that Claremore train, right? But it could be something else, right? So that's not a great example, but it is an example of how our experience shapes how we hear things. Physical scientists were hard at work demonstrating that various forces, waves, and energy in the physical world are not directly, but rather indirectly perceived by the senses. We can think of something like sound waves, for instance. However, due to advances in measurement technique, now those waves and energies are able to be measured and analyzed indirectly. And that was a huge step forward for neuroscience, which was definitely in its infancy at this time. All right, we're on to our man Helmholtz, born in a Prussian town near Berlin. Looks like he lived to be about 73, which was pretty good back in the day. Helmholtz did not come from a wealthy family, remember that. He had a father who was very, very intelligent and was a high school teacher who was also, it just so happens, interested in Kantian philosophy. If you remember from our previous conversation, Helmholtz attended a very prestigious high school, and he wanted to study science. But that was not something that just anyone could do. If you had money, then you could study science, right? But someone of his socioeconomic status needed to get more of a quote-unquote real job, more of a structured vocation, so to speak. Luckily, Helmholtz received a scholarship to attend medical school. Was he super interested in medical school? What do you remember? No. What was he consumed by? By physics. Yeah, very good. He loved physics. Anyway, he received a scholarship to attend medical school, and in return, he was to serve in the military as a surgeon after graduation. When he went to school, he was introduced to many people who were not necessarily medical doctors, but people interested in physics, interested in some of the same things he was interested in. And again, as we see with so many of the philosophers, the early scientists, who they met and where they were made a huge difference and shaped their philosophy and understanding. All right, before I turn the slide, does anyone remember what happened with Helmholtz in terms of his military vocation? Did he spend the rest of his life enamored by the military? He left, right. And he was able to leave due to some things that happened. Good. All right, going back to his time in school, he began studying physiology with Mueller during his second year of school. Mueller, however, still clung to the doctrine of vitalism, this idea that Everything that's living has a non-physical life force that's essential to keeping them alive and is not able to be analyzed by scientific methods. The thinking at this time, everyone, was that with death, the life force departs and goes onward, and our physiochemical processes can run free, which means, AKA, decomposition of ourselves. Not pretty, but it happens. Helmholtz, among others, he was around, and others who were scientists during this time rejected vitalism. And he adopted the doctrine of physiological mechanism. Again, I hope that you see the reflection of the work of Descartes here, right? Descartes believed that the human body could function like a machine and would draw a lot of analogies to organisms functioning as machines, this idea of physiological mechanism, right? So this is not a new idea, but rather an idea that Helmholtz is building on. He stated, really, all physiological processes could be understandable in terms of chemical and physical principles. No gods of any sort required. This idea revolutionized physiology. All right. So Helmholtz is an army surgeon, but I guess not a lot of people need surgery, which is a good thing. He had a lot of time, free time, and so as one does in the barracks, he set up a lab to study metabolic processes of frogs. That was a facetious statement, right? It's kind of interesting to think of him being an army surgeon and having this lab of frogs, right? And he examined these metabolic processes. He found that ordinary chemical reactions were capable of producing all of the physical activity and heat generated by a living organism. Let's take a moment and turn to our textbook. And we are on page 143. If you want to follow along at the top, young Helmholtz now turned his attention to a related idea that was just then being debated by physicists, the law of conservation of energy. And at the time, this was a very hypothetical notion. This was the idea that all kinds of forces in the universe, heat, gravity, magnetism, light, and so forth, are potentially interchangeable forms of a single huge but quantitatively fixed reservoir of energy. This next sentence may sound familiar to you. Energy can be transformed from one state to another, but never created or destroyed by any physical processes. The total amount of energy in the universe is constant and conserved. All right. So Helmholtz was offering these ideas that were backed by what he was doing in the lab, right? He just wasn't thinking deep thoughts and sharing those. He had evidence to back up his claims. And this evidence was found to be pretty impressive to the Prussian government. And they said, you know, Helmholtz, let's have you devote more time to your frogs and less time to army surgery. They might not have said it that way, but basically that's what he did. He was named a professor of physiology at Kant's Old University, and he continued a study, or conducted a study, concerning the speed of nerve signals, which had major implications for both neurology and physiology. All right. Let's go ahead and look in our book. I believe we're going to be on page 145. To test his ideas, 144. Helmholtz devised an ingenious instrument using the degree of deflection of a galvanometer needle to record small fractions of seconds that were detectable by existing timepieces. Okay, so he attached an electrical stimulator to a frog's leg, and then, I know, poor frog, and then he shocked the frog, and he measured how long in milliseconds it took for the frog to respond to being shocked. And what he found is the further away from the midline of the body the shock was, the longer it took the frog to sense it. So if a frog is splayed out, stretched out long, then getting to its little froggy toes, as you can see there, they have many kind of odd looking toes, right? Different toes, that's going to take longer than if you bop or send an electrical impulse, I'm trying to keep it nice and kind sounding, to the frog's neck. And this was a huge, huge discovery in terms of reaction time. Something that's funny, I'll close with this on Helmholtz. He wrote in what is called, quote unquote, a dense literary style. So he had a lot of ideas. He was very brilliant. He tried to share these ideas, right? So you want to be able to share these ideas that you have based on all your work with the general public. But the way he wrote was so verbose that people had a really hard time understanding him. And I'd like to read this quote on page 144. If you go to the third paragraph down, I actually have a little note that says, read out loud. So I'm going to now do that. It says, at first, most scientists failed to appreciate the significance of Helmholtz's experiences because of his dense literary style. His friend said, your work, I say with pride and grief, is understood and recognized by myself alone. Evidently, his friend had superior intellectual capabilities, right? You have, ... expressed the subject so obscurely that your report could at best only be an introduction to the discovery of method. A little bit of an insult. In fact, quite a bit of an insult. And just letting Helmholtz know, but if you're going to make this available to everyone, palatable for people, you need to think about how you're writing out your findings. This is followed up by words from his father, right? His high school teacher father who was really into Kant. Helmholtz's father attended a lecture and found his son so little able to escape from his scientific rigidity of expression that I am filled with respect for an audience that could understand and thank him for it. Luckily, we have been able to take away a lot from what Helmholtz did, regardless of how he wrote about his findings. Okay, any questions over what we covered so far today? We talked about Hume, right? We talked about Kant, and we talked about Helmholtz. These are all people that you'll be asked to talk about in more detail on the next exam. And they're very foundational, especially when we look at the field of neuroscience. Okay. Okay, moving on. Okay, we are on day 12, History and Systems. We were not here for day 11, so we go to day 12. All right. How many of you have heard the term gestalt in any way, shape, or form? Okay, maybe a little bit. I see hands like halfway raised. Anything you want to share about that? Or you're merely letting me know you have heard of that phrase before?
Well, I was wrong in what I thought it was. So it's not. I'm thinking of
It's-
gestation, and it's not.
Oh, okay.
That's what I thought it was. It's not that.
Yeah, I was trying to figure out a way I could make that right on some level, and I'm really hard pressed to do that. I like to try to be, positive, but any thoughts?
Kind of like focused on it is what it is, not necessarily delving into everything that constitutes it. It's just it is what it is.
Yeah, form versus function is a very simplistic way of putting something that's not so simple. Before I start talking about Gestalt psychology, I want to let you know that Gestalt principles are used a lot outside of psychology, in visual art, in marketing, things of that nature. So that has a lot to do with the way Gestalt came into, the idea of Gestalt came into being. And I promise, or I hope that will make more sense as we go on. All right, so turning to our PowerPoint. Gestalt psychology focuses on the way the mind organizes experiences. We've gotten to the point where we're on board saying, yes, our mind is an organizer. Yes, we employ a nativist view and believe in the innate abilities of the mind. So that focuses on ways the mind organizes experience and perceptions into organized wholes that are more than the sum of its parts. Gestalt is very close to the German word for form. Let's look on page 161. There's a little bit of mention about form qualities. I'm on the second paragraph if you'd like to follow along. Form qualities cannot be introspectively broken down into separate sensory elements, but instead resided in the overall configurations of objects or ideas. Okay, big concept, the squareness of a square, for instance, and the melody of a musical piece reside not in their separate parts, but in their total configurations. Does that make sense? So we see the square as a whole, and it's recognition of that as a whole that makes it a square. We hear a melody as a whole, even though there are different bits and pieces that go into it. Being a musician myself, I really like this idea, the way it was conceptualized. It says, the tune of a song retains its distinctive and recognizable qualities, regardless of the key in which it's sung. How many of you sing Christmas carols or listen to Christmas carols during the holidays? Yeah, what's a favorite Christmas carol of yours? I personally like O Tannenbaum. I don't know if that's one that's on your radar, but it's a little bit different. And Here We Come a Wassailing, which I always thought was waffling when I was a kid. But how about some of yours? Do you have a favorite one?
I know Jingle Bells is one that's really
Jingle Bells, okay. And that can be played by many different instruments, right? And there's a ton of variations on Jingle Bells. Others?
One of my favorite ones like here is like Carol of the Bells. I like that.
Yes, Our flute band plays Carol of the Bells, and that's always a crowd pleaser. Anything else? Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer? Okay, whether you listen to Gene Autry sing it in the key of, let's say, G, for Gene Autry, or you hear Michael Bublé sing it. I'm not a big Michael Bublé fan, and he sings it, but that's neither here nor there. I needed to probably not say that. Sorry, Michael, I'm sure you're watching. If he sings it in the key of C, we're going to recognize it as the same song. Make sense? Okay. So regardless of the key in which we hear Rudolph, or whether it's played at the highest register of the piccolo or lowest register of the tuba, how many of you are musicians? We're musicians. All right. But you know what a piccolo is? Tiny flute. And a tuba, not a tiny flute. Not a wood one either. Okay. I found Ave Maria played on the clarinet and flute for us to listen to for just a moment. I think that's a beautiful song. It's another one of my favorite songs. Unfortunately, these arrangements aren't exactly the same. What I want you to realize, however, is as you listen to it, you can recognize that it's Ave Maria when it's played on the clarinet, and you can also recognize that when it's played on the flute. Or the piano. Really beautiful, right? And now we're going to hear that same, I'll say, general arrangement on the flute. Hold on just a second. We might be hearing a different one. And you can hear rhythmically it's faster, right? And it's in a different key. Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed that, and also learned, or it reinforced the idea that we can hear the song Ave Maria and recognize it in different keys, played by different instruments, etc. All right. Okay. Let's move on. Okay. Wertheimer, Kohler, and Kafka founded a movement they called Gestalt psychology. Wertheimer specifically studied the optical illusion of apparent movement. And apparent movement defined is the perception of continuous motion that occurs when observing a succession of slightly varied still images. Did any of you growing up, and I'm going to really date myself, but so I'm a little bit afraid to keep going, but I had this book, and it basically became like a little cartoon. You could flip through it, and you would have like Mickey Mouse, and Mickey Mouse would do something like, you know, walk like this, or, you know, over several pages. So some of you remember that, right? And it's the idea that Mickey Mouse was not actually moving in any of those, but our mind's eye perceived movement through the flipping of the pages. And how quick the movement was a function of how quickly we flipped through those different separate images. Same thing holds true in claymation. Again, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, one of my favorite songs, one of my favorite movies. That's a great stop motion sort of animation, and you can imagine back in the day how long that took. There's also, I want to say Gromit in someone, that might not be right, but, huh? Wallace and Gromit. Okay, some of you know about that. Spectacular claymation, right? Well, I'm glad this idea wasn't missed on you. I'm not perhaps quite as ancient. I'm not from the Age of Enlightenment, at least, as you might have thought. All right. We are now going to turn our attention toward animation basics, the optical illusion of motion, and this is going to build on what we just talked about.
Bridget Jones. It's time to live.
Make sure this isn't too loud.
Take a series of still, sequential images. Let's look at them one by one. Faster. Now let's remove the gaps. Go faster still. Wait for it. Bam! Motion. Why is that? Intellectually, we know we're just looking at a series of still images, but when we see them change fast enough, they produce the optical illusion of appearing as a single, persistent image that's gradually changing form and position. This effect is the basis for all motion picture technology, from our LED screens of today that our 20th century cathode ray forebears, from cinematic film projection to the novelty toy, even, it's been suggested, all the way back to the Stone Age when humans began painting on cave walls. This phenomenon of perceiving apparent motion in successive images is due to a characteristic of human perception historically referred to as persistence of vision. The term is attributed to the English-Swiss physicist Peter Marc Roget, who in the early 19th century used it to describe a particular defect of the eye that resulted in a moving object appearing to be still when it reached a certain speed. Not long after, the term was applied to describe the opposite, the apparent motion of still images, by Belgian physicist Joseph Plateau, inventor of the phenakistoscope. He defined persistence of vision as the result of successive after images which were retained and then combined in the retina, making us believe that what we're seeing is a single object in motion. This explanation was widely accepted in the decades to follow and up through the turn of the 20th century, when some began to question what was physiologically going on. In 1912, German psychologist Max Wertheimer outlined the basic primary stages of apparent motion using simple optical illusions. These experiments led him to conclude the phenomena was due to processes which lie behind the retina. In 1915, Hugo Munsterberg, a German-American pioneer in applied psychology, also suggested that the apparent motion of successive images is not due to their being retained in the eye, but is superadded by the action of the mind. In the century to follow, experiments by physiologists have pretty much confirmed their conclusions. As it relates to the illusion of motion pictures, persistence of vision has less to do with vision itself than how it's interpreted in the brain. Research has shown that different aspects of what the eye sees, like form, color, depth, and motion, are transmitted to different areas of the visual cortex via different pathways from the retina. It's the continuous interaction of various computations in the visual cortex that stitch those different aspects together and culminate in the perception. Our brains are constantly working, synchronizing what we see, hear, smell, and touch into meaningful experience in the moment-to-moment flow of the present. So in order to create the illusion of motion in successive images, we need to get the timing of our intervals close to the speed at which our brains process the present. So how fast is the present happening according to our brains? Well, we can get an idea by measuring how fast the images need to be changing for the illusion to work. Let's see if we can figure it out by repeating our experiment. Here's the sequence, presented at a rate of 1 frame per 2 seconds, with 1 second of black in between. At this rate of change, with the blank space separating the images, there's no real motion perceptible. As we lessen the duration of blank space, the slight change in position becomes more apparent, and we start to get an inkling of a sense of motion between the disparate frames. 1 frame per second. 2 frames per second. 4 frames per second. Now we're starting to get a feeling of motion, but it's really not very smooth. We're still aware of the fact that we're looking at separate images. Let's speed up. 8 frames per second. 12 frames per second. Looks like we're about there. At 24 frames per second, the motion looks even smoother. This is standard full speed. So the point at which we lose awareness of the intervals and begin to see apparent motion seems to kick in at around 8 to 12 frames per second. This is in the neighborhood of what science has determined to be the general threshold of our awareness of seeing separate images. Generally speaking, we begin to lose that awareness at intervals of around 100 milliseconds per image, which is equal to a frame rate of around 10 frames per second. As the frame rate increases, we lose awareness of the intervals completely and are all the more convinced of the reality of the illusion.
All right, takeaways from that video. Not everyone all at once.
I thought it was interesting how like the different frames, like how we perceive it, like the faster it goes, the more our brains are able to like, okay, put it together versus when they're
Right.
smaller or
Yeah.
slower.
Yeah, exactly. Seems to be like that tipping point when all of a sudden we perceive that perpetual motion, like when that animated character that was walking. Good start, thank you. Others? All right, I may ask you at the start of class on Tuesday. But for right now, you are saved. I will go on. I think. Let's see. I'm actually trying to open up as many tabs as humanly possible at this moment, just in case you were wondering what I was doing. Okay. On my quest to find our PowerPoint, which has disappeared into thin air. Give me just 1 second. Okay. Right. Hopefully you understand this idea of perpetual motion and the ability of our mind to fill in the blanks, so to speak.
Gestalt psychologists emphasized how the mind tends to organize the elements of experience into wholes, whose significance is much greater than that of their summed individual parts. You may have heard the phrase, the whole is the sum of its parts. And a lot of people think that's a phrase from Gestalt psychology, but Gestalt psychologists would say that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts and is indeed different than just the sum of its parts. Everyone with me? Rather than, as many people try to do, break down elements into small pieces before trying to understand the whole. Like we're going to gather information about A, B, C, and D in order to understand this phenomena of F. With Gestalt psychologists, they're going to start with the phenomena of F, and then they're going to look within that at the different pieces that make up that phenomenon. Perception always occurs, if we think about this in terms of our sight, in a field divided into what's known as figure and ground. And I promise very soon these pieces that are related to vision will make sense as they pertain to psychology. I think they already pertain to psychology in that we're talking about sensation and perception, but they'll pertain to a broader aspect of psychology a little bit later.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the Brain Boost channel. So today we're going to be talking about Gestalt psychology, what this means, and certain examples of it. So let's just dive right into the video. So what is Gestalt psychology? This is just a school of thought that is based on perception and organization of information. So to very loosely and generally define what Gestalt psychology is that our minds tend to perceive things as part of a whole, and that we have a predisposed way or predisposed ways of organizing information in our brains. So these are very loose definitions of Gestalt psychology, but hopefully once we get into these examples, this will make more sense. So the first example here is the figure-ground perception. So what this states is that we perceive images as figure and ground. So figure is associated with an object, and ground associates with the background. So if we take this image, for example, one might say that they see a white vase on a black background. So the figure here is the white vase and the ground is the black in the back. Conversely, another person might say that they see two black silhouettes of faces looking at one another on a white background. So in this case, the figure are the two faces and the ground is the white background. So the next one is the proximity principle, and this states that objects that are close to one another are grouped together. So if we take this image, for example, one might just say that they see, a bunch of circles and a bunch of triangles here on this sheet. But because of the way our brain organizes information, you might actually notice that these circles are forming a shape. And that is a diamond in the middle. And this is just based off of the proximity principle. Because all these circles are arranged so close to each other, we tend to perceive it as a greater, image or shape in this case. And then you can kind of also say that we see a bunch of little triangles in the corner of a bunch of smaller triangles here. So the principle of similarity is the next example, And what this states is that objects that are similar to one another are grouped together. So if we take this image, for example, let's just ignore the fact that there's a distinct line separating two separate images. We're just going to pretend like this is one entire audience. But basically, the principle of similarity can be based off of size, color, etc. So in this case, if we have an audience at a football game, for example, we look into the audience and we will compartmentalize or organize what we see as based on their similarities. In this case, it's by color. So we will group the yellow shirts together and the white shirts together. And so we get these distinct almost two populations of fans in the audience. The next one is the principle of closure. So what this states is that when we see an image that may have missing parts to it, our brain are going to fill these missing parts in and complete the image in our head. So in this case, you could say that there's just a bunch of pentagons on a sheet, but because of principle of closure, our brain is going to automatically almost fill in the image and say, no, I see a soccer ball right here. Even though there are no lines around, we just fill it in with our imagination, really. Next up is the principle of good continuation. So this states that people tend to perceive continuously flowing and smooth lines even if there is interruption. So if we look here, we notice that these are a bunch of squiggles or waves, wavy lines here. And what we see, the pattern that we see here is that we're following it almost as if these are two strands of hairs, right? We're following this first one going up, then down, then back up as a wave. And then the next one going up, then down, and then back up. It's almost as if it's two sets of waves just slightly staggered. But this is because of the principle of good continuation. Because technically, another way we could see this, but we don't, we could see it as this first point here that my pointer is at, going up here, and then we stop where they cross and it goes back down. And then another point here, and it goes back up here. And then another point here, it stops at this cutoff where they cross, and then it comes back up like this. But we don't organize the shapes like that. We don't organize the lines like that. We organize this as a continuously smooth flowing line here and here. So that is principle of good continuation. We can also see a little bit of principle of closure here. See, there are gaps here and even here, there's a big gap, and our brain could technically just fill it in. We could easily just make a curve here, make another one here, make another one here, make another one here, make a nice big one here and a nice one there, and we will continue the way the lines flow together in our heads. And the last one is the principle of common fate. So what this states, I apologize if you hear my keyboard going crazy. So what principle of common fate states is that objects that move together tend to be grouped together in our heads. So you might see a flock of birds flying in one direction, and you will group them together based off of their common fate, so to speak. Same thing goes for fish. If you're watching like a documentary, for example, and you see a bunch of fish going in one direction, you almost group them together like this image here. So that is it for today's video. Make sure you like this video, you comment any other videos that you would like to see from Brain Boost, or any questions you have on the topic covered today. Make sure to subscribe to the channel for more videos from us and hit the notification bell.
Okay, I think she did a pretty good job explaining those concepts in ways that are easy to understand. I know for myself, when people start to talk visual art and those concepts, a lot of times I get super lost. All right, what I'd like for you to do now is go ahead and let's convene into two small groups. So we have a natural group, right, by grouping right here. And then we're going to make this into a tighter group with closure. Okay, so close on over. What I would like to do in each of your groups is look for some images that are pretty popular in terms of marketing media. For instance, like the McDonald's arches or the Subway logo, FedEx logo. I want you to pick about 5 different logos and be ready to share some of those, or I can pull them up on the big screen as it were. And I want you to see if you can figure out which of those laws are being used to help you understand that figure or what it's supposed to convey. Murky, or does that make sense? Kind of makes sense? All right.
Everyone, I'm passing around a sign-in sheet, so if you can sign it for me.
Thank you.
Are you finding some good ones? Yeah.
Is there
Or
any
finding
kind of-
some?
I can't really describe it very well. Oh, yeah. It just looks like it's moving. Yeah. Which one's the?
Thank you.
Which way has the T?
Yeah, I'm pulling up all the names of those right now.
Whoa! Okay, that's actually cool.
Once you see it, you can't see it.
Yeah. It's supposed to look like a chicken nugget also.
Yeah.
Background.
common fate, is that what you said?
Let's take 2 more minutes.
Really good continuation because the A like is.
We could also use
The New Balance logo.
for principle of similarity.
These that are slashed, yeah.
It's like a red circle and the other one.
Oh, yeah.
You just see that looks like an object, it's like something moving forward has a little shadow effect. Just sort of bigger shadow. That's all I can see.
Okay. Which group would like to start us out?
Wingo.
Okay. What are some of the logos that you looked at?
We did the Arby's for closure, cause like your
Arby's?
yeah,
Okay, let me pull that one up for,
back is a hat, but Arby's goes through it. So like the lines aren't.
Mhm. We have the meats. That sounds really good. I'm very hungry. I don't know about you.
I am too. I remember doing them.
My favorite thing is the roast beef with, and then I also like the French dip, but with no cheese. All right, so say that one more time.
So like how the hat isn't like complete, like
Mhm.
your brain can like close those lines off and like finish the picture.
Right. If we really think about it, look at that. That shape, without the existence of this shape and the proximity, would not give us an Arby's hat, right? But these elements taken together form that in our mind. Excellent. Give us one more that you did.
We also talked about the MasterCard logo.
Okay, let me pull that up. Okay, which one?
The principle of similarity.
Okay, is there any here in particular you want me to pull up?
No, any of them are good.
Okay, so principle of similarity.
Yeah, just because they're both circles, but they're different, but they come together.
Yeah. So I'm gonna pull up one more for us to look at on the big screen, okay?
The New Balance.
Okay. All right, and we want the New Balance logo, I'm guessing?
Yeah.
Okay. Does this one work? All right, tell us about this.
The common fate. The principle of common fate.
Mm-hmm.
Wait, let me break. Okay, because it looks like it's moving. The lines.
It does, which give this, the motion, so the shape of the really narrow V's, I suppose. It's a little bit hard to explain, right?
Yeah.
When we try to break down this thing into its different parts, the slanting of the N and the B. And then do you really have an N and a B there? We have this, right? These lines in our mind.
So it could also be.
Right. We see the N here and the B here, even though if we were to look at that as two separate parts, it might not hold true, but together it really, really works. And there's this idea of perpetual motion. Excellent. All right, my other group.
I think the first one that we had was there's a group called Executive Homes.
Yes, I see that sign on my way to work. And it took me a long time to really recognize what I think you're going to say.
Yes.
Just one second, let me do logo. They have a neat logo, don't they?
They really do.
Do they, is this?
I Googled Tulsa for example.
Okay, and, cause it's a little bit diagonal, right? Yeah. Does this work?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So we see, not so big. Oops. Still not big at all, is it? But tell us what we're seeing here for those of you that can see something.
Figure and the ground. So depending on whether you look at the light part of it or the
Ta-da!
dark part of it, so you can see the E's and the H depending on whether you're looking at the dark or the light.
Yeah, exactly.
Which whether you calculated it right or left.
Yeah. And be careful when you're driving and you're looking at this. I couldn't figure out the image for the longest time. I struggle a little bit visually and spatially in terms of my awareness, and it took me a while, but it's really a brilliant melding of the E's and the H, right? Yeah. All right, what else do you have for us that's maybe I can find that's bigger?
For the principle of good continuation, we said like the Chanel logo with the double C's.
Oh, okay, yeah, I love that. All right, does it matter which one I pick?
No.
Okay. Okay. So we see the two C's. Yeah.
Or our brain continues on with the C's versus like they're saying in the video, like cutting across or doing it in a different way. Our brain just automatically.
Exactly. Good job. All right, one more.
For the principle of closure, one of them we looked at is like the Pepsi logo. How on the one side, like usually it's just like the red, white, and blue colors. Usually it's not like super defined, but we still close it off. Like when we look at it, we see a circle, even if it's not that defined.
Right. Yeah, so we tend to see a circle, the red, white, and blue conveying also just other things being conveyed, like America, right, with the red, white, and blue. Want to show you one more logo. World Wildlife Foundation's very similar to this one that you mentioned. We see a cute panda, but really, we have a white background and we have these shapes, and we fill in the rest. One thing I want to say is we would only fill that in as a panda if we'd seen a panda before, right? Similarly, we would only think of that soccer ball image if we'd seen a soccer ball before. That's a caveat to all of this.
One more logo I will show you, and then we are out of time. All right. You see the arrow right there? Yeah. So that idea of motion. I just thought that one was interesting. All right, what I'd like for you to do over the weekend is go ahead and finish up reading chapter 4 and start chapter 5. We're going to have to sail through 5 next week and start 6, which is Charles Darwin. He's one of my favorites. We'll be talking about evolutionary psychology and have a